Hey everyone, I just wanted to do a quick tutorial on how to add more movement to your basses. So what we're going to try and emulate is a sound I used in one of my productions here. As you can hear, there's a lot of movement in that bass. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a initial patch in Serum, and we are going to start off with a spectral wavetable. In this case, we're going to use Monster 5. And just with that and having an LFO on the wavetable position set on a very slow rate, in this case I'm using 4 bars, we already get a lot of movement. So that's something that I really wanted to point out. Wavetable positions, go through them. A lot of times we'll just use a saw or sine wave, an FM, and maybe Unison. But some of these wavetables that have really interesting characteristics in them, you can get some very interesting movement in your bass by utilizing that wavetable position. So to build on top of that, we're just going to keep creating more movement here. I'm just going to go over a bunch of different ideas. The other one is to use FM. We're going to use FM on oscillator from oscillator B, and we're going to start off with the octaves as +1 and see what kind of interesting movement that could bring in. So right there we have even more movement, and what I like to do is I like to experiment without putting an LFO on it first and see where I want the ranges to be. In this case, anything around here sounds pretty good to me, so I'll just put an LFO there. So now you're getting even more movement. Implementing the Unison, we could get a little bit more. Adding some Detune. And we could also modulate the Detune. Be careful about how much you modulate this, because you're going to get a lot of stuff lost in the sauce if you put a really high detune amounts. You start getting a little bit atonal, you start getting very noisy, phase cancellation becomes an issue. So when you modulate something like this, be very careful about how much you modulate and how much unison you add. Also, experiment with what kind of basic shape you're using to FM from. So in this case, we have a sine. For me, it sounds pretty interesting to FM against this triangle wave. The sine wave sounds very nice as well. You can also change your semitone value here to +7 if you want. And you can mess around with these values as well. They'll give you different characteristics. So that's another way to get in movement. You can modulate even between the octaves that you're FMing from. We're not going to do that right here because that's going to get just a little bit more messy if we're starting to go from +1 to +2 to +3, but you can get more movement there as well. Of course, your filter is a big place to get movement, and if we have a filter, so now we're kind of getting like these waves that are coming in. If we go to our FX, let me turn these all off here, and we just start adding in distortion, and I'm just going to use a tube distortion for this. A lot of that high end now is becoming really crunchy. really nice. Now, if you don't want the high end, you have another filter. It's a filter that I don't see used as often as the main oscillator filter, and that's the distortion filter. So if I don't want that high-end crunch, in this case I really like it, but let's say I didn't, I can throw on this EQ, and I've also added this LFO to the frequency of this EQ. So we still keep getting a little bit of movement. We still might get a little bit of that crunch, but it's gonna take some of it away. And because we have 4 bars on our LFO here, you can hear that that filter is opening up at bar 2 because we have this filter shape here. So at this maximum point here, we're at 2 bars. Then we get to 4 bars where it's completely back down to this original shape. So really what the filter is doing, even though there's no visual indication, this seems to be some of the struggles some people have with the distortion filter, is essentially what's happening is this. This filter here, I'm moving it with my mouse now because there's that lack of visual indicators. It's opening, it's closing, and your LFO is completely responsible for that. Now, I wanted to show all this mainly because I see a lot of people using hyperdimension to add more space, to add more movement. It is another tool in your toolkit. You can use it, but I wanted to make sure that everyone out there is educated on all these other tips for movement. So having a wavetable with some different harmonics, having a wavetable with different formants in it, and modulating throughout that wavetable is one way to add movement. We talked about Detune and Unison. That's a really common one that a lot of people already know about. FM from B on its own doesn't really have a lot of movement to it, but put an LFO on it, experiment with it, change the LFO shape, see what kind of results you get. Because we have an LFO now that's affecting 5 different things, if we change its shape, it's going to drastically change our sound. Some ways it's not going to be pleasant to your ear. Other ways it is going to become pleasant. So all right, maybe you want to do something along those lines. You can get really experimental if you start changing this LFO speed. Again, not always going to have the best result, but mess around with it. So right now we have something that's still pretty interesting using the 8th notes. So feel free to experiment with that. Feel free to also change the speed, the rate of your LFO. So we just did that here manually, but keep in mind, you can automate this as well. So in different parts of your production, maybe you want to go from having that slow modulation of 4 bars to something more like a 1/8. And it's important to experiment with those types of things. So I just want to provide this video real quick for folks that just have more tools in their toolkit. Of course, I had to see what OTT sounds like on this sound, but which also you can modulate that. You can get real crazy and modulate the bands in particular on the OTT within Serum or SerumFX. But you know, that gets a little crazy too when you start modulating all these different bands. But you can modulate the mix, which is sometimes pretty cool, because maybe you don't want the signal to completely be mixed in with your OTT. Maybe you want it in the beginning of the attack for it to be 50%, and then you want it to be 100%. That's going to give you some different effects. That's going to give you more movement. That's going to move the volume, move the dynamics around your mix. So hopefully this was useful and you learned a few tips, a little more tools on your tool belt. And if there's anything that I could clarify on a little bit more, or expand on a little bit more, I'll try and do that in some future videos with some more sound design techniques. Thanks for watching. See you all soon.